Sí, gracias, doctor Martínez Rodríguez. Queremos que las preguntas las pongan en el espacio de preguntas y respuestas para posteriormente tener la posibilidad de interactuar con algunas de ellas y mantener registro de ellas. Muchas gracias. Estábamos 2 minutitos pasados, pero a mí me gusta cuando se habla de agendas nacionales, así que eso es importante. Muchas gracias. Vamos a la próxima presentación y ahora para compartir pantalla con la doctora Lisa Vandiver específicamente y su presentación. Así que el doctor Martínez puede cerrar ahora compartir su pantalla para pasar entonces a la doctora. La presentación de la doctora tiene como título, ¿verdad? Assessing the Effectiveness of Watershed Restoration on Nearshore Ecosystems through a Multi-spatial and Multi-temporal Monitoring Program. Y la doctora Vandiver es una especialista de restauración de hábitats marinos del Centro de Restauración de NOAA. En el centro la doctora trabaja con comunidades del Atlántico Sur y del Caribe para proteger y restaurar hábitats costeros para fortalecer poblaciones de peces y la recuperación de especies amenazadas o en peligro y apoyar comunidades resilientes en áreas costeras. Espero que me estén escuchando ahora mismo. Me veo ahí una pantalla frisada. Quiero estar seguro de que todo el mundo me esté escuchando.
Sí, te escuchamos. No entiendo la pantalla, pero te escuchamos súper.
Ok, por lo menos no quedé muy mal ahí en la pantalla. Por lo demás, por los pasados años, la doctora Vandiver ha estado apoyando las iniciativas de restauración de cuencas en Puerto Rico e Islas Vírgenes, encaminando la protección y restauración de hábitats de corales y de hierbas marinas. Y ella ya ha sido mencionada en algunas de las presentaciones que hemos tenido durante el día de hoy. Así que quiero pues ver si la doctora Vandiver está por ahí para compartir su pantalla. You're viewing the screen, pero creo que tiene su pantalla frisada con la imagen mía. Ahora estamos ahí. Si puede ella compartir su pantalla y presentación, pues podemos pasar a esta parte. Aquí vamos. Muy bien. Ok, tenemos la presentación en pantalla. Perfecto. Ahí tenemos la presentación. Destaco las otras personas y los otros colaboradores que ella pone en su transparencia y con esto pasamos a la presentación de la doctora. Adelante. No la estamos escuchando, doctora, si está hablando. No sé si tenga en mute.
Lisa, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about those problems. Thank you, Buenas tardes. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate being able to listen in and hear about all the great work in Puerto Rico and beyond, and thankful for this opportunity to share some of our work that we're doing in Culebra. As building off of what Tanya Metz had previously said, as you know, land-based sources of pollution pose a threat to seagrass and coral reef habitat throughout the Caribbean. And NOAA utilizes watershed restoration as a means of reducing these threats. Historically, our funding has been focused on the implementation of these projects with limited funding dedicated to monitoring to evaluate the success of these investments. So for this presentation, I'm going to highlight some work that myself and my colleagues listed here have been doing to engage interagency collaborations to develop a monitoring and evaluation framework to allow us to evaluate success across multiple spatial and temporal scales in Culebra. Before I jump in, I just want to acknowledge that the work that's been done on Culebra from implementation, watershed management planning efforts, implementation, building local capacity, and monitoring. It's all been a broad partnership effort that ranges from federal, jurisdictional, local government agencies to nonprofits, academia, as well as for-profit organizations. So I want to take a moment to thank everyone that's been involved. So as Tanya laid out very well, and so I probably don't need to go into this too much, NOAA's LBSP management approach begins with the watershed assessments, which she laid out very well. This information is then used to identify priorities for restoration and establish achievable goals for our watershed restoration efforts. Following that, as we're implementing, ideally, this would be coupled with a robust monitoring program to evaluate project success, not only at the site itself, but for those target resources, which in this case is corals. But as I mentioned, monitoring has been fairly limited in the past. Monitoring typically has been limited to the project site, but fortunately, this year, NOAA is investing in the development of a multi-spatial, multi-temporal framework to allow us to better inform the need for corrective actions, as well as to evaluate the collective impact of our work on our coastal waters and habitats. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm just going to walk through, quickly highlight between Roberto and Tanya. I think you've got a good idea of what the management priorities are for NOAA, but just want to quickly highlight those. Then hit some points on why we need a monitoring and evaluation framework and the importance of it. Then jump into kind of the process that we are currently undergoing to develop that framework, provide some preliminary outcomes, and then next steps. So as Roberto had mentioned, they're following our watershed assessment and the development of the restoration plan. NOAA identified those actions and those locations that we felt that we could implement projects to provide meaningful reductions in watershed pollutant loads over time, as well as improve coastal habitat conditions. These actions are generally covered in these 4 strategies here to stabilize unpaved roads, which is here in the red. You can see the priority locations in the red. To stabilize coastal zones, which is in the blue. To provide enhanced wastewater treatment, which is in the green here. And then also to provide enhanced stormwater treatment, which is in the purple. The implementation of these actions were prioritized in those watersheds where we felt that we could get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of investment for benefit to our coastal resources. In particular, our unpaved road stabilization and the wastewater treatment plant work are being scaled up to a degree that we anticipate this restoration alone could elicit a watershed scale response. So here on the left, I just have an example of kind of the story for unpaved roads, where across the island, there's 50 miles of unpaved roads. We prioritized 28 miles of that for stabilization to date. 5 of those miles have been stabilized, 10 are currently in progress, and we have this year finished acquiring all the funding to stabilize the remaining 13. So across all of those priorities that we identified, NOAA and our partners have received all the funding needed to implement 100% of the NOAA designated LBSP priorities so that we can fully implement and evaluate our management success across multiple spatial scales. To do this, we wanted to just very clearly highlight what we think our success could be at different spatial scales. For the BMP and site level, this means that within 5 years, we hope to have 100% of the projects identified, project priorities identified, implemented, which will result in a reduction in sediment and nutrient loads discharged from the site If we're able to do that by 2025, we anticipate that at the watershed scale, or at least shortly after 2025, we should see a reduction in sediment and nutrient loads from those priority watersheds that we had identified. Later on, we anticipate some level of lag in response in the system. So we're thinking that approximately 5 years later, we may see improvements in our nearshore physical environment. And basically what we mean there is improvements to water quality and reductions in terrigenous sedimentation. And then later beyond that, once we see an improvement in the nearshore physical environment, we anticipate seeing a benefit to our seagrass and coral reef conditions. So that that outline of success kind of establishes the framework by which we can begin to ask ourselves questions about whether we have been successful. By engaging in a monitoring and developing out a monitoring and evaluation framework, we will be able to ask specific questions and answer those questions to help us better understand how well we are achieving the work that we're doing, or provide tweaks where needed. In particular, we want to know what % pollutant removal can be anticipated for the BMPs that we're implementing, and what level of watershed scale pollutant load reduction is achievable in these ecosystems, and at what point can we anticipate a change in the nearshore environment, whether it be water quality or benthic habitat condition. We also want to be able to track those changes over time so that we can then go back to those goals and evaluate our potential for success. And the most important part of this is that by asking these questions and really taking a close look at this work at multiple spatial scales, we'll be able to inform the need for corrective action or adaptive management along the way. Ultimately, this is all to assure that we get the biggest bang for the buck, essentially. The science also dictates that it's really important to keep asking these questions. Over the years, we've had difficulty linking watershed restoration to coral benefits. This is likely due in part to the lag in response in the system from the BMP to the watershed to the nearshore ecosystem. But it also has to do with the residence time of the pollutants themselves and the fact that resuspension plays a role in our nearshore environment. And also when it comes to coral reefs in particular, the impact of external variables impacts our ability to see changes as a result of LBSP management. However, there recently has been promising advances in the science. In particular, Carlos had highlighted some of the work that he was doing in the farms in the Guanica watershed. He's also replicating similar work here in Calabria, and so we're getting some good information coming out of that. In addition, in American Samoa, they've recently done a multi-spatial, multi-temporal monitoring program in Funga'alu as a result of some of the LBSP management work that they did there. And they've been able to see a change in suspended sediment loads coming from the watershed itself, comparing pre to post restoration. And for small storms, it's been as much as an 86% reduction. And then when you look at this in terms of coral reef habitat and what it means in terms of density of your coral recruits, we're seeing for a cropperid species, when you compare the 2013 densities of coral recruits to later years post-restoration, we're seeing an increase in coral recruits, suggesting that this LBSP management can be effective and we can detect change at the scale of corals. Lastly, we've also been evaluating the potential of looking at seagrass as an indicator species to address some of our concerns about external variables. So as I mentioned, for this, what we are doing is developing a monitoring and evaluation framework. There's a lot of work that's been done in the past, so there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. And there's a lot of partners, which you can see here listed on the right side, that really could bring a lot of information to the table that we can build off of. So the important part of this monitoring and evaluation framework was to set up a process that allows for engagement across all of these partners to share our successes, share lessons learned, to learn things about local information we know about the local environment and build off of that. Unfortunately, as we were planning to do this, we entered COVID times, which actually, surprisingly, because we had to do this in COVID times, it actually enhanced our potential of expanding the partnership by offering this as a webinar versus an in-person meeting. So that was an added bonus, I guess, if you will, from some of the remote engagement that we had to have. The important thing when building this framework was that we needed to develop, before we could start this, we had to develop a common language, make sure we had a base level understanding of what the needs were and what the questions were that we needed the monitoring and evaluation to target. And lastly, the most important thing that we're trying to do is to identify opportunities to fund monitoring that's mutually beneficial, not only to the researcher, but to the manager as well. So this is just a general overview of the process. So in mid-July, we had an introductory webinar, and at this webinar is where we brought those partners together to make sure we had a baseline understanding of the system itself, what the management questions were, and then from there, later in the month, we convened a group of local researchers to share the information that they know about Culebra's ecosystem and its response to LBSP threats. After that point, we then broke out into working subgroups. These working subgroups were broken out into the 4 different spatial scales: BMP, Watershed, Nearshore Physical, and Nearshore Biological, to really dig in and develop out the framework. And the hope is that by January, February of 2021, I'll be presenting out the framework to this group to get their final feedback. So just to, again, so it was really important to establish the questions that we wanted to really focus in on, so that we could get the best feedback from these participants. So for each of the spatial scales, we highlighted, coming out of the goals that we had, which are here in yellow, we identified what our primary evaluation questions were. These evaluation questions then established the basis for what we would focus on in our working subgroups. So for our working subgroups, we used those evaluation questions and really dug in to identify, first and foremost, those indicators that were most sensitive to LBSP threats, and tried to get a focus on the methods that would provide us the highest return for the lowest cost. There were also other things that we considered in terms of logistics, preference and frequency and timing, considerations of siting, and also opportunities to build off of existing data and programs. So just some really quick results here. These are preliminary, and I'm still hoping to vet these with the larger group, but just wanted to highlight that we, just a couple things. The most important thing is that for the baseline data, it's really key to establish baselines across multiple spatial scales to identify the metrics that are most sensitive to change over time. And what we found in our discussions, this is kind of a graph just to let you know generally what level of baseline data we have. The most important thing to hone in here is that we have very limited water quality data or sedimentation data. So this is going to be a focus for the monitoring and evaluation framework moving forward. The good thing is we do have a good bit of site and watershed scale data to work with. In terms of indicators, this is a ton of information, and what I just wanted you to know is that we had like I had mentioned, for those working subgroups, you have your spatial scale here, your evaluation questions here, and then we had indicators identified for each of them. Again, for BMP and watershed, we have a lot of the information for these indicators, but it's those nearshore physical and biological indicators that we're really going to need to focus in on for our monitoring and evaluation framework. These are also the most expensive indicators, so it's going to be really important to build out partnerships to identify opportunities to leverage one another here. Recognizing that, I think the framework will include a range of funding scenarios to allow greatest amount of flexibility to engage partners while also meeting the requirements of the framework. And I've just got a couple more slides and I'll be done. So next steps, one of the main priorities is going to be, in order to engage partners and help others understand how they can engage in this process, we really need to know where are those locations that are going to be most beneficial in terms of informing our management questions. So those locations are pretty well known for our watershed. It's the unpaved road stabilization and the wastewater treatment sites. But it's for those nearshore locations that we're kind of uncertain. And so we're currently funding studies to identify discharge points to the nearshore and evaluate spatial distribution of those pollutants. And we're hoping to do this from a remote sensing perspective, looking at coastal hydrodynamics and mapping of sediment plumes. If that isn't helpful enough, then we'll follow it up with synoptic surveys to make sure that we're identifying the most important places that are most sensitive to LBST threats, but also are likely to see change over time. I'm also continuing to identify opportunities. This includes a range of things. I mean, I think the most important thing, and one of the reasons I wanted to present to y'all today, was working with other partners to identify these opportunities. In particular, looking within existing monitoring programs and having discussions about whether there's opportunity, flexibility in these programs to integrate fixed stations or even integrate new indicators into these programs. We're also looking externally for additional funding opportunities. And I think the most important thing is that for Calabria in particular, because it's remote, it's really important to keep the local partners at the center of this. And so continuing to collaborate with them, because they're going to be key to the ultimate success of the monitoring and evaluation framework. So with that, I am done. Thank you again for this opportunity.